Hi, and welcome to the Banker's View from Sibos series, filmed on location here in Toronto. I'm Joy Macknight, Deputy Editor at The Banker, and I'm joined by Dominic Broom, Global Head of Trade Sales at Bank of New York Mellon. Thank you so much for joining us today.
It's an absolute pleasure, Joy.
So can you tell me, what are the global headwinds that trade is facing today?
Well, you say headwinds. I think what one should reference is that 2017 looks set to be a positive year for trade, with the highest growth rates estimated by the WTO and other global bodies that we've seen in the industry since before the financial crisis. So that's a positive. Not to say that there aren't headwinds that we're facing. I think compliance and KYC remains an onerous but important part of the industry, and certainly an area that is, I think, causing a degree of stress and strain relating to certain geographies as we look at the space globally. Another area, undoubtedly, is noises. More noise right now, thankfully, than action around protectionism. Being here in Canada, one obviously has to reference the decision taken in the last couple of weeks around Bombardier and the US government. I personally believe that that's a regrettable step, and I sincerely hope that that's not a prediction for moving forward. I think finally, access to trade finance, and this is particularly acute, and something that we might address in a little more length in a moment. Access to trade finance, particularly in developing economies, by small, medium-sized enterprises remains challenging.
Okay, because as you say, the trade finance situation is quite difficult. There is like a 1.5 trillion financing gap.
Indeed.
So how can that be addressed?
I think the great news is, and I'm more of an optimist than a pessimist on all of this, is technology has a great role to play here. At the heart of many global banks' platforms, indeed ours at BNY Mellon, is a vast amount of data. So it's the interpretation and transmission and sharing of that data that I think can help solve, particularly for some of these compliance and know your customer challenges that the industry is faced with. Technology applications, APIs, robotics, etc., are helping to reduce cost in this space. That's great news ultimately for participants, but most importantly for the end user. And I would signal out initiatives that are being managed at a global level, such as the GLEI, the Global Legal Entity Identifier. I think if governments, regulators, the industry at large can come together to really promote that sort of thing, an ability, almost like the barcode has become ubiquitous over the last numbers of decades in the consumer space. I rather view the GLEI as the barcode for corporate governance, and that is going to be, if broadly adopted, a huge step forward for the industry and make the access to finance that much more straightforward.
So obviously there's a huge amount of hype and buzz around blockchain. What difference is it really going to make within the trade finance space?
I think it has huge potential, but it's certainly an area that is fraught with complication. Fraught with complication not because the concept of a distributed ledger is either new or in of itself potentially particularly technologically difficult, but it's the number of participants that are typically involved in any trade finance transaction that make the adoption of distributed ledgers potentially challenging. The way I see the business moving forward in terms of that adoption is ultimately, obviously, participation and collaboration between banks, the trusted global counterparties in the business of trade finance, as they've been for hundreds of years, but with applications and know-how being brought by fintechs into the space. Now, in a way, that's the easy bit, one might say. The challenge is going to be assuring global adoption in a manner that does a number of things. One is that is straightforward for end users to access. I think one of the huge changes we've seen over the last couple of decades in the world of trade finance is that the dominance of a relatively small number of global corporations controlling at its heart end-to-end global or cross-border trade. That era is now behind us, and where the growth in the industry is trade between small, medium-sized enterprises on different parts around different parts of the world. So they need to be able to access, and they need to be able to transact in a relatively standardized and seamless fashion. Well, as your viewers and you would recognize, transacting involves regulators, it involves customs counterparties, it involves shipping companies, a whole diverse set of players, and a degree of standardization is going to be required if these methodologies and practices and procedures are going to benefit the industry going forward.
So how do you think banks should be responding to this whole new wave of sort of the digitalization of trade?
I think recognizing its potential first and foremost, and what it is going to force players in the trade area to do is to be resolutely focused on where their particular value add is. At its heart, I think digitization has opportunities such as we're already witnessing within BNY Mellon to eliminate complexity and cost from our business. So for example, not far from here in our upstate New York operation in Utica, we've already implemented the use of robotics and self-learning technologies to drive efficiency in the management of trade finance. That's efficiency not both in terms of cost, but also in terms of speed. And obviously trade is a very time-specific, time-dependent business. So that's an area where we, for example, can focus and excel. But for other banks, the focus might be on the customer acquisition or the risk distribution, depending on where they sit within the trade finance value chain. And open access technologies can bring those various elements together and I think allow for a greater degree of cross-regional and enterprise collaboration, ultimately to the benefit of all.
Excellent. Thank you so much for your insights, Dominic. I hope you have a nice conference.
Thank you too, and the same to you and your team.